In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, Amen. And so welcome everybody to tonight's talk. Again, I'll try to keep it to a 40-minute talk. It is a dense talk, just like last week. Last week, we looked at the nature of the oral tradition and how historians authenticate ancient documents. We determined that there is extensive evidence for the reliability of the New Testament, especially the four Gospels. And we also briefly considered the immense cost that was paid by the disciples and the writers of the Gospels in preaching the message of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Another area that is often brought into question is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And that's going to be our focus tonight. So what kind of evidence do we have available to ascertain that the resurrection of Christ did in fact happen in history? So two groups of people really forcefully deny the resurrection. So there are the atheists, especially the new atheists, and there are the Muslims. So Islam denies the resurrection 100%. Of course, we understand that if the resurrection of Jesus did not in fact happen, and then we have no Christianity at all, and any kind of discussion about Christianity would have to come to an end. So all of Christianity hinges on the resurrection of Christ. As St. Paul states, if Christ had not risen, then our preaching is in vain and your faith is in vain as well. So usually the way this doubt is expressed, the doubt about the resurrection, is expressed in two ways. One way is the tone of voice that the people employ, which goes something like this. You really believe that Jesus rose from the dead? In this 21st century, you still hold this childish belief? How can any educated person, and especially any scientist, believe in the resurrection? So there are two important things to take note of. First, there is the tone used in making these statements. And second, there are certain assumptions that underlie the statements themselves. So before we can begin to unpack these statements and really address the issue at hand, I always encourage that before we go into a full defense of anything, that we begin by asking the person who's in doubt, ask for more clarification. So for example, people who question the resurrection or claim that being a scientist negates belief in it, base this on some fundamental assumptions. They assume that miracles cannot happen. So miracles there's no way that we can accept that miracles occur. And also they do not believe that Jesus died on the cross. So we have these two issues that kind of underlie that doubt about the resurrection. So we begin by asking, do you believe in miracles? So get the person to articulate whether or not he or she believes in miracles, and if not, then get them to articulate why. Get the person to become more conscious of what his underlying beliefs are. And then move on next to ask about whether the person believes that Jesus died on the cross. Again, if the person does not believe that Jesus died on the cross, get the person to articulate the reasons that he or she holds to have that kind of belief system. So we allow people to give evidence for what they believe. We allow them the time to articulate their thoughts. By asking this question, these types of questions, you're permitting the opportunity for people to examine their own thinking and their own beliefs and their own assumptions. And this helps establish a less hostile environment when you're actually talking about issues that are dear to your heart and really important to your heart. And it also opens up or permits an opportunity for a more open-mindedness when the discussion actually takes place. So before dealing with the resurrection, we must begin by examining the nature of miracles. Simply put, atheists do not believe in miracles because they're convinced that miracles violate the laws of nature. They claim that if we accept miracles such as Jesus's resurrection or the virgin birth or changing water into wine, we are effectively, according to the New Testament, the atheists are saying, we would be holding a worldview that has nothing to do with science, or science has nothing to do with the worldview. So what they're basically claiming is that science and miracles cannot mix. You cannot be a scientist and at the same time believe in miracle. In their opinion, they seem to contradict themselves. When they make this claim, they employ mockery. Again, that tone of voice they use when they question the resurrection, because they don't really have anything to substantiate it. So what they resort to is mockery. And everybody knows that mockery is not an argument. Mockery, its intention is to humiliate the person that holds these beliefs. So sadly, what happens is when professors or highly esteemed individuals mock biblical miracles, for example, they're viewed as credible because it's coming from people that are held in high regard, people that hold professorships in universities, for example. So we do need to understand the nature of miracles and be able to speak about it intelligently and be able to explain it to people intelligently. So I'm going to reference the writings of John Lennox. Dr. John Lennox is a scientist. He is a mathematician who holds a professorship at Oxford University, and he is also a very highly esteemed Christian apologist. I've mentioned this before. He is one of the very important voices in Christian apology, a very important person to be reading his work and listening to his lectures, because he really has a very clear understanding of all the philosophical and theological arguments that are brought to the table. So the first thing that Lennox says is, if there is a God who did in fact create the universe, then there is no difficulty in believing that he could do special things in the very universe that he created. And that makes a lot of sense. He is the creator and he can intervene in that creation of his if he so chooses. He's God. Also, that miracles, genuine miracles, are supernatural events. They are definitely supernatural events, but he explains that not all supernatural events are miracles. So consider, for example, God created the universe. The creation of the universe is a supernatural event, but it is not a miracle. And the reason why it is not a miracle is because prior to creation, there was no normal course of things. So for a miracle to be understood as a miracle, it has to actually go against an established order of things. So not all supernatural events can be regarded as miracles. Because miracles concern events that are exceptions to recognized laws. So miracles already presuppose the existence of the normal course of things. Scientists really resent, new atheists, scientists really resent the idea that some God could arbitrarily intervene or alter or suspend or reverse or otherwise violate the laws of nature. And the reason they really resent this is because they say that this would contradict the immutability of these laws, and therefore they would overturn the basis of scientific understanding of the universe. What that means in simpler form is the laws of nature are to be trusted, which is a big thing for them to admit. And when a God intervenes in the laws of nature, then that makes the laws of nature no longer trustworthy. And therefore, it kind of shakes the foundation on which scientific inquiry is based. So they argue that belief in miracles, especially New Testament miracles, this is a really important point. that it arose in primitive pre-scientific culture where people were ignorant of the laws of nature and readily accepted miracle stories. However, in order to recognize an event as a miracle, there must be some perceived regularity. That means we can only understand the abnormal if we know what the normal is. So the Gospels clearly do not show the people of the New Testament to have been these ignorant of laws of nature and living in pre-scientific cultures, and they were just gullible people that accepted whatever was told to them. Let's take Zacharias, for example, the priest. He had a very firm belief in God. He had an equally firm belief in the existence of angels. He was conversing with an angel. He had a very firm belief in the power of prayer. He was inside the temple praying. But he knew he was too old to father a child. For him and his wife to have a child at such an old age would run counter to all that he knew about the laws of nature. So he said, I can't believe that this can happen. How can I and my wife have a child at such an old age? He had a very difficult time believing, just the same way that you and I, living in a scientific age, would equally have a very difficult time believing. In the end, Zacharias and Elizabeth and everybody believed. They didn't believe through ignorance or being very gullible. They believed because the evidence was presented in front of them. They did, in fact, have a child, John the Baptist. So this is a very important point to keep in mind because it comes up often when we look at how atheists oppose many different aspects of Christianity. So that accusation that when we look at New Testament time and the people that lived in that culture, they try to paint them to be ignorant, gullible, that they can easily buy into fairy tales and just accept whatever is presented to them. But that is not the truth at all. These assumptions that equate being primitive to being ignorant is in itself a very ignorant statement to make. Further evidence is we have the Sadducees, who also had a very firm belief in God, but they didn't believe in the resurrection of the body. They completely rejected that idea because they felt it went against the laws of nature. So these people were not, it may have been a pre-scientific age, but they were not ignorant about the laws of nature. They were actually very smart people. And we also see that historians tell us that ancient paganism contained all kinds of theories, all kinds of really bizarre beliefs that they had about mythology and how gods intervened in human life, and they treated people like puppets, and they used the forces of nature to kind of attack man and get man to oppose man and all of that. But actually, these ancient pagans, they did not believe in the resurrection of the body. They also felt that this went completely against the laws of nature. So therefore, to suppose that Christianity was born in a pre-scientific, gullible, and ignorant world is simply false, as the facts really clearly indicate. And many events in the Bible would support the fact that these people were not ignorant. Understanding the laws of nature does not make it impossible to believe in the existence of God, one thing, and it does not end the possibility of his intervention in the universe. Just because we understand the laws of nature or the laws of gravity, for example, does not in itself make a claim that we cannot believe that God can intervene in the world that he created. Lennox gives an example of that. He says it would be like claiming that an understanding of the laws of internal combustion engine makes it impossible to believe that the designer of the very motor car or his mechanics could or would intervene and, for example, remove the cylinder head. Intervention would not destroy the laws of the combustion engine. The very same laws that explained why the engine worked with the cylinder head would be the very same laws that would explain why the engine does not work without the cylinder head. It is, in fact, a law of nature that human beings do not rise again from the dead by some natural mechanism. But then Christianity does not claim that Christ rose from the dead by such a mechanism, but in fact, Christ rose from the dead by a supernatural power. It was God himself that resurrected the body of Jesus Christ. So when a miracle happens, it is the laws of nature that alerts us to the fact that it is a miracle. It's these laws that that actually clarify or illuminate that miracle for us. So now we can move on. When speaking of the resurrection, there are two fundamental questions that we need to answer. The first question is, did Jesus in fact die on the cross? We have to establish his death before we can establish his resurrection. And then the second question is, did he in fact appear to people? Are there eyewitnesses that actually saw a Christ in the flesh after he died? So now we begin to address the very first question. Did Jesus in fact die on the cross? So Lee Strobel, in his research, he met quite a few people that dedicate their lives to investigating this, and he shares with us medical evidence for what actually happened to Christ from the moment he began to be persecuted. So we begin with the Garden of Gethsemane. What happened is, in the garden, Jesus was experiencing a great deal of psychological stress. The Gospels tell us that he began to sweat blood. So is there medical evidence for that? So there is. There is a medical condition called hematidrosis that explains it's associated with a very high degree of psychological stress. So this causes, when this happens to a human being, it causes the skin to be extremely fragile. So when he was flogged, his skin became extremely sensitive. So here we have at the garden, Christ is under a tremendous psychological stress. He's sweating blood, very rare kind of medical condition, but it does exist. And now he is taken to be flogged. So what was this flogging? What was it all about? People have a misconception that he was whipped, but he wasn't whipped. He was flogged with, so imagine a whip, and then you imagine from this whip comes down a whole bunch of braids, leather thongs, braided, and in the braid, they interwove metal balls. So you have each braid would have a number of metal balls woven into the braid, and you have quite a few of them at the end of the whip. Also, they included in this whip, they included sharp bones. So the balls caused very deep bruises to the person's body and contusions. That means the skin would be ripped apart, and it would further be opened with every blow. How many blows? There were 39 times that the person was flogged. The bones would cut the flesh so severely so that the back would be shredded. They would actually, the back would be shredded, and sometimes the very spine would be exposed. The person would experience very deep cuts from the shoulder, the back, the buttocks, and the legs. Like they didn't leave any part of the body untouched. So this resulted in massive blood loss. You can only imagine, I mean, it's a very graphic picture of what Christ went through in that 39 whips that he got. So what happens when a person undergoes massive blood loss? The heart races to try to pump the blood that is actually not there. So the heart is racing very, very fast. The blood pressure drops, the person becomes very, very fatigued and ultimately collapses. And then the kidney stops producing urine and the person becomes extremely thirsty. So these are the results of this type of massive blood loss. So do we see evidence of this in the Bible? We do. We see that on the road to Calvary, Jesus staggered. And then ultimately he collapsed and they had to get someone else to carry the cross on his behalf. And then on the cross, we see Jesus say, I thirst. That thirst is part of what happens to the human body when it undergoes this tremendous blood loss. So Jesus was in serious critical condition before the nails were actually driven into his body. The nails were about 5.6 inches long, and they were tapered at the end to a very sharp point. The nails were not driven in the palm. Many of the pictures show that the nails were driven in the palm. If the nails actually had been driven in the palm, they would have ripped through and the person would fall off the cross. The nails were nailed in the wrist about an inch or so from the palm to stabilize the arm on the cross. And then nails were driven in the feet, and this inevitably crushed the nerves in the feet of the crucified person. In this case, it would be Jesus. His shoulders were dislocated, and the pain of the crucifixion was so unbearable that the Romans had to create a word for it, a word to explain the pain associated with crucifixion itself. And that word we use in the English language today, it's the word excruciating. So when you say, I am in excruciating pain, you actually remember Christ and his suffering on the cross. Crucifixion was essentially an agonizingly slow death by asphyxiation. Asphyxiation means that the person suffocates to death. On the cross, a person is in a vertical position. So you're like this and you're trying to inhale. So you have to push with your legs up to inhale a breath and then come down again. Every time Christ did this, his back scraped against the wood of the cross. And remember that the back, most likely the spine, was exposed. And then he would do it again. He would lift to be able to breathe, and he would come down again. And ultimately, he would become too exhausted. The foot and the back would be in excruciating pain. So this would lead to complete exhaustion. So the person would no longer be capable of pushing himself up in order to breathe. And that's when actually Jesus knew that he was dying. And that's when he cried, Lord, into your hands I commit my spirit. At that point, Jesus died of cardiac arrest. Before death, the extreme blood loss would have caused heart failure. Now, heart failure results in a collection of fluid around the heart. This explains that when a soldier thrust a spear in the right side between the ribs, the spear went into the right lung and into the heart. When the spear was pulled out, some fluid was pulled out as well. It appeared like water followed by blood. So because of the presence of both blood and water, there was no doubt in the soldier's mind that Jesus had already died. The spear and not the broken legs fulfilled the Old Testament prophecy about the Messiah. His bones would remain unbroken. So people say that Jesus wasn't nailed to the cross, he was tied to the cross. We see many pictures of that. But in 1968, so here we're looking at external evidence for what the Gospels are telling us about the events that happened at that time. So in 1968, there was an archaeological dig in Jerusalem, and they found the remains. They actually found a really big grave that had in it a lot of these, because a lot of the people that were crucified were ultimately thrown into one big grave. And they found the remains of Yohanan. So they named him. I don't really know how they came up with the name, but they found that he had a 7-inch nail or at that time attached to his foot, which showed conclusively that crucifixion did happen by nailing the person to the cross. And then another thing that people have a problem with is that they say that these soldiers had no medical training. So how could they have possibly ascertained beyond a shadow of a doubt that Jesus had died? Well, the soldiers were not trained medical officers, what they were, in fact, they were trained killers. And killing was their job. And these people were chosen because they could do their job really well. Remember, this is now Roman society. There is no room for messing around. So they knew without a doubt that when a person was dead. Mistakes, if they make a mistake in determining whether a person is dead or not, it would result in their own death. So these people had a huge incentive to ensure that no mistake took place, especially with Christ, because he was such a renowned figure at that time. So they would have never taken the risk of making a mistake as to whether Christ died on the cross or not. So people push the issue a little bit more, and they say, could Jesus have survived the cross? Let's see if there is a possibility that he could have survived the cross. Well, he couldn't have for a number of reasons. There was massive blood loss before the crucifixion. On the cross, you can't fake your inability to breathe for too long. You do reach a point where you just really, honestly, you cannot breathe. The spear was thrust right into the heart. That in itself would put an end to any life. And the Roman soldiers were not at all prepared to take a risk in making a mistake about this man's death. So again, they ask, well, let's assume the impossible. Let's say that he did survive by some miracle. What would he have looked like? Well, he wouldn't have been able to walk. He wouldn't have appeared on the road to Emmaus. He wouldn't have been able to use his arms or legs. And he would have had very severe, very serious, massive wounds in his back and in his spine. So a person in that very pathetic kind of state, very weak, in dire need of help, would not have inspired his disciples to go out and proclaim that he is the Lord of life who had triumphed over the grave. It just wouldn't have made any sense. At that point, the disciples would have been far stronger than he at that point. So did Jesus die on the cross? The medical evidence clearly shows that there is no chance he could have survived such atrocities that he experienced on Calvary. So now we can consider the second question. Did Jesus really appear to people? So again, we go back to eyewitness testimony plays a very important role in this. So to answer this question, we have to look into the nature of Christian thought before the writing of the New Testament. Remember that Christianity was spreading rather quickly, but the Gospels hadn't been written yet. So we have to refer to early Christian creeds, and there are many of them in the book, in Corinthians, in Galatians, in the book of Acts. Many Christian creeds that were driving the Christian movement at that time. We're only going to look at one because it is the most significant of the creeds, and this is 1 Corinthians 15 verse 3. which is, according to scholars, is perhaps the most important creed in the whole of the New Testament. It states, this is Paul speaking, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received." So this is the oral tradition. He's receiving something from eyewitnesses, that Christ died for our sins, according with the scriptures. The scriptures here would be the Old Testament. So he died, he was buried, and he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, again, reference to the Old Testament. So the creed clearly outlines exactly what the events were, that Christ died, he was buried, and he was raised on the third day. And as the passage continues, Paul records appearances of the resurrected Christ to quite a few people. So he appeared to Peter, he appeared to the 12 disciples, or to the 12. He doesn't actually say disciples, because that number, the number 12 here, is a little bit questionable, because of course Judas Iscariot wasn't there. To over 500 persons at one time. That's really important. He appeared to 500 witnesses that could attest to the fact that they saw him in the flesh. He appeared to James, he appeared to Paul himself. All critical scholars across a very wide theological spectrum concede that this confession is an early Christian pre-Pauline creed. That creed, and that Paul received most likely from Peter and James, from firsthand eyewitnesses, and he himself witnessed Christ when Christ appeared to him. This is the creed that was being taught about Christianity. They date this creed to earlier than 5 years after the crucifixion. You don't get anything so early in any other document on this earth. So the creed is as early as 5 years from the actual events of the crucifixion, which means that we're looking at material that comes directly from the events in question, directly coming from the time of the crucifixion and the time of the resurrection. And this creed then is crucial in any discussion about the death and resurrection of Christ. When you read books about the resurrection, the 1 Corinthians 15, number 3, becomes one of the primary creeds that everybody refers to. The factual witness of the death and resurrection of Jesus also became an apologetic for Christian belief. Remember also that when disciples were chosen, they had to have that one condition, that they were witnesses to the death and resurrection of Christ. So there are very important 4 facts to highlight. Jesus's death was due to crucifixion. We have evidence for that. The disciples were very convinced of his appearance. They saw him. They were convinced it was him. He even asked to eat because he wanted to prove that this is not a spirit, it's the actual body that was resurrected. And also the third fact is that the disciples completely transformed. They completely changed after they witnessed the resurrection of Christ. They became less fearful, more courageous. They were ready to set out and preach the way, preach the good news, knowing very well the kind of hostility that was awaiting them outside their door. Also, the fourth one is Paul's conversion appearance, that he also believed was an appearance of the risen Christ. So these 4 core facts are widely accepted as knowable history. These are historical events that people no longer deny. Each of the core facts is established by means of normal historical methodology. And we talked about this historical methodology when we discussed the reliability of the Bible. The resurrection has remained established in the face of criticism for more than 2,000 years. Remember, even the Jews had a problem with the resurrection right at the time that the event was reported. So from that time till today, people have been questioning the resurrection, and the resurrection has stayed intact for more than 2,000 years. The various types of evidence for this event are outstanding. The evidence is overwhelming for the resurrection of Christ. It actually surpasses that of the great majority of ancient events. None of the ancient events that we are aware of can compete with the kind of evidence that we have for not just the reliability of the Gospels, but the resurrection of Christ. There is indeed historical proof for this event. Jesus did rise from the dead in real history. This week's talk and last week's talks have been very, very dense, full of a lot of information. In addressing atheism as the aggressive type of atheism that we are exposed to today, we have dealt with three of the most difficult areas, which is evolution, understanding evolution, and understanding how evolution is linked or not linked to belief in God. We've looked at the reliability of the New Testament Gospels. We've looked at the evidence for the resurrection of Christ. These are three of the most difficult, most dense areas of research. And believe me when I tell you that the research is just, it's huge. Really, people dedicate lifetime to researching these issues and really making sure that the world has trust, founded trust in Christianity. If God permits and Abuna permits that we can go on to explore atheism a little bit more, the topics wouldn't be as dense. They would actually, if we ever get a chance to meet in church in person, we could form little groups and begin to look at other issues and train ourselves how we would actually address them. Because speaking about the truth of Christianity requires practice. That's how apologists do it. They actually sit and practice. They have a question or a contention, and they practice how they actually go about addressing it. I hope that you found last week and today's talk helpful. And if you have any questions or if you're looking for any resources, just let Abuna know, and I'm more than happy to share with you whatever it is that I have access to. Thank you, and good night.